identification. And we worked on this webinar with the Citizen Lake Monitoring Program, Water Action Volunteers, Wisconsin DNR, and the First Detector Network. Ooh. Sorry, my slides are stuck. Just an overview of what we're all going to cover during this webinar. Just a pretty quick introduction to welcome you all. And then we're going to go over the different species groups we'll have, and each presentation will be 20 to 25 minutes. We're going to first cover submerged aquatic plants and then go over the aquatic and wetland animals that we should keep a lookout for, riparian plants and upland wetland plants that you might see when you're along lake streams or wetlands. And then we'll have a question and answer period. So the species that we're gonna review are all species that are identified, almost all of the species that are identified in NR 40. Chapter NR 40 is our invasive species identification, classification, and control rule. So this is species that we've identified as issues within the state. We've said that they're invasive and we want to be able to keep a lookout for them. So we selected target species from within NR 40 that we'll see when we're out in lake streams or wetlands. So you can go to our NR 40 website to learn more about the species that we identified and regulate. For each of the species that we're going to cover, we're going to go over just key identification characteristics. So certain things about each species that you need to look at to be confident in your ID for them. And then we'll talk about just the different parts of these plants or animals. Then we're going to all share phenology information that was put together by the Wisconsin First Detector Network. And you'll see in these slides, we'll have the list of the species and just to show you the symbology so each presenter doesn't have to go through it. There's going to be different colors for the life stage that you'll see at the time of year. We'll also have symbology for detectability. If it's a hollow circle, it's not detectable during that time of year. If you only see a quarter circle, it's low, half is medium, and full is high. And like I said, that's can be found at the First Detector Network, and we'll provide that a link to where you can see more information later in the PowerPoint. We'll also share distribution maps for each species, and there'll be small screen clips of this map that you see in the state of Wisconsin. For the most part, we're pulling our maps from the Lakes and AIS mapping tool that's available on the DNR website, and it's tied to all the data that we have in the Surface Water Integrated Monitoring System, which is where we enter all of our data for monitoring efforts for aquatic invasive species. Where you see the green check, it means it's a verified Eurasian water milfoil, and then some of these are just lines if it's along a section of stream where it's found, and if we have a hash mark, that's going to be a polygon. So they're not all going to be big like this with the big check marks. They'll be a little harder to see. You can see this Vilas Oneida County. So not all the maps are going to be totally visible in the PowerPoint, but you'll be able to access them through our mapping tool.
Yes, we'll start on aquatic invasive animals. There are fewer of these than there are the submerged plants. So we're going to go through 11 species today with a few lookalikes. And you'll notice that I don't have a phenology chart up for these, and that's because they live in the water. So they are there year round. If you can get into the water to find them, most likely, if they're there, they're going to be there. So we'll start with the Faucet Snail. It's a right-handed opening snail. It's oval in shape. It's about 5 to 6 whorls, and it does have an operculum, so it is able to seal that shell. I didn't include a picture of the operculum specifically, but it is distinct in that there are concentric rings on just the operculum itself. We do have several populations in Wisconsin, in the Lake Winnebago area and the Mississippi River. Uh, the next species we have is the spiny water flea. And you notice on the map when Maureen mentioned before that we have some polygons that show up instead of check marks, that we have the blue, which isn't the greatest color for these polygons, but showing where the spiny water flea is more so than those check marks. These are very small animals, quarter inch to half an inch. And they're distinct in that long spine that they have and that dark black eye. They can commonly be found on the fishing line toes in kind of big groups of almost hair-looking creatures. But again, that big black eye is what's going to be distinct on them. The next two species are different mystery snails. We have the Chinese mystery snail and the banded mystery snail. The Chinese mystery snail, it's smooth, it's 2 inches long and approximately the same size wide with 6 to 7 whorls. And what's distinct about the Chinese mystery snail and the banded mystery snail is the banding on those snails. So they're distinctly striped. This one's olive green and found pretty much all over the state except for the Southwest. There aren't as many verified populations. And then the banded mystery snail is more brown and white, kind of mottled looking, but still has those distinct bands. It's a little bit smaller than the Chinese mystery snail, and still has that right-handed opening. They do have a native look-alike. There is a native brown mystery snail, and you'll notice that the difference here is that while there are striations in the shell, there's no distinct banding there. They're also a little bit smaller than the snails, than the invasive snails, but as snails are able to be different sizes, that's not necessarily the best factor in determining native versus invasive. That would be that coloration. The next species is the Asian or Asiatic clam. These are really distinct in their texture, so you'll know it's an Asian clam just by running your fingernail along those ridges and kind of feeling how deep the grooves are. They have the inside of the shell, it's often a purplish color, and sometimes there is a purple band is one of the concentric rings on the shell. When populations show up, they can really carpet the bottom of a water body and become kind of the substrate of that water body. So we do have some distinct Asiatic clam populations in the state. Trying to see, yep, that relatively newer ones in the Rock County area. And there is a native look-alike for the Asian clam, and that's the native fingernail clam. The distinct difference there is just the texture of the shell and the relative size. Fingernail clams don't get much bigger than the average person's fingernail. And they're going to have a relatively smooth outer shell as opposed to that clam, with the Asiatic clam, which again is distinctly ridged. Up next, we have the quagga mussel and the zebra mussel will be the following slide. I don't have a map for the quagga mussel, unfortunately. The biggest trouble here is going to be differentiating the quagga mussel from the zebra mussel. And some of the ways to tell the difference are that this is a much more rounded creature with an asymmetric shell. You can see that in that lateral view there. Um, and the bristle on the quagga mussels are near the back of the animal, and those are those thread-like silky fibers that help the mussel attach itself to substrate. And this picture down at the bottom of the slide kind of shows what the distinct features of the quagga mussel are versus a different, the zebra mussel. So if we go on to the zebra mussel, you'll see I have a similar picture to show what the differences there are. And it's a much more symmetrical animal, both sides of the shell looking mirror image of each other. Those bristle fibers are much more central to the mussel shell, with distinct populations in the Winnebago area, the Lake Michigan area, the Mississippi. And it looks like we have some questions in the chat. And thanks, Paul, for answering some of them for me. Just read them out loud so that people can kind of know what's going on. Someone asked if the water fleas swim on the top of the water, and the answer there is no, that they live in the water column. So that's one of the reasons those toes are sent out down into the water column to kind of pull them out of the water. And as far as the invasive snails and the damage they do, there's the same issue that we have with a lot of the invasive species in their competition with the native species, but then also faucet snails can carry certain parasites, and when and they tend to climb high up on the grasses in the stream or at the edge of the lake. So waterfowl find them a good food source, an obvious food source, just kind of hanging out right there. But they can infect the waterfowl with this parasite that can be deadly. So with that, move on to I think our one and only fish in these slides, and the reason that this is aquatic animals and not aquatic invertebrates. The round gobi, found just north of Lake Winnebago. When they're young, they're a solid gray color, and they take on this more mottled color that you see in the photo here as they age. Somewhere between 3 and 6 inches long. They can be just kind of held in the palm of your hand. And what's distinct is that they have a single pelvic fin with suction cup-like properties. The next species is very well distributed across the state, and I think that most folks are probably familiar with it. And that's the rusty crayfish, really distinguished by those red rusty spots on the sides of its body, and also by the black bands on the tips of the claws, but mostly through those rusty colored patches that give the rusty crayfish its namesake. Continuing in the world of crayfish, we have the red swamp crayfish, which I believe does have a second verified population, not just the one in northern Dane County, but it's very dark red. It's 2 to 5 inches long. What's distinguishing about it is that black wedge-shaped stripe on its abdomen, and it is commonly confused with the white river crayfish, which we'll look at the next slide. But moving on to that, I would take a good look at the claws of the red swamp crayfish on this slide, because that's going to be one of the distinguishing factors between the red swamp crayfish and the white river crayfish. And we have a question in the chat about how serious of a problem are the red crayfish, and I'm gonna pass that off to Paul or Maureen to answer that question at the end of this section of the presentation. So again, taking a look at the claws of the red swamp crayfish and looking at its native look-alike, the white river crayfish, which still has that distinctly bright red, dark red body, but can have more brown of a color. The white river crayfish has very long and narrow claws, and unlike the red swamp, when the claws are closed, there's no space between the top claw and the bottom claw. It's they close flush with one another, and that would be that, and the slender features of the claws would be one of your distinguishing factors there. So these two are very commonly confused. But not so much with the rusty crayfish. The last species we have is the New Zealand mud snail, mostly an issue down here in south central Wisconsin. It's got a right-handed opening, 7 to 8 whorls on the shell, although they're very hard to count because the snail itself is so small, maxing out between 4 and 6 millimeters. Like the Faucet snail, the New Zealand mud snail does have that operculum that it can close up and seal its shell with. And they reproduce very dramatically, asexually via cloning. Only females exist in this part of the world, but it doesn't matter because of asexual reproduction. And with the speed at which they can reproduce, they can carpet water body bottoms. So while it might be really hard to discover a single one of these snails, groups of them are easier to identify, just sheerly because of the numbers. So I'll take a second to look at the chat box again for questions, and then we will move on. Maureen or Paul, would you like to, you guys are more of the experts than I am on the problems caused.
Yeah, I can touch on the red swamp crayfish. So they're going to predate upon other animals. They'll be voracious eaters, just like the rusty crayfish with the vegetation, but they also attack young fish, macroinvertebrates, and they're fairly prolific. The other population where the check box didn't show up in your map was near a couple of small ponds in southeast Wisconsin, where we spent close to $1 million to, we believe we eradicated the population, but that required us to fill 1 or 2 of the ponds, and then use some pretty heavy chemical, and then completely replace and line these privately owned ponds, and then put cobble back in to have less suitable habitat for them. There was that one occurrence in southeast Wisconsin, and then where she showed on the map, and was it still Dane County or towards Sauk? It was in Sauk City, where they were released near the Wisconsin River at the Sauk wastewater treatment plant. There was a population of about 1,000 that had been dumped, some living, some dead. But law enforcement fortunately found out within hours of the dump and were able to dig trenches and put up silt fencing, and then they hand removed maybe 1,000. We've been monitoring the site since, and we'll be working with citizen volunteers as we can. So they're very concerning, and anytime we see anything about a crayfish boil, somebody follows up to make sure they're not red swamp, to make sure that the restaurant hosting the crayfish boil is aware that these are prohibited species in Wisconsin, and they mostly agree.
Can I add a little bit to that, Maureen?
You sure can, Chris.
One of the other issues with the red swamp crayfish is they have a tendency to burrow, so they can become really destructive on, the shorelines, or especially if there's a dike system or something like that. I was able to work down in Germantown when we first found those, and we were able to dig out some of the burrows, and some of them extended, almost 2 feet, 3 feet back into the bank. So that's another issue with them.
And I'll just jump in again quick too. The rusties they get extremely abundant in some situations, and they tend to just eat anything. They'll eat plants, they'll eat fish, they'll eat eggs. Any kind of invertebrates they run into, they'll kill each other and eat them. And so they become an issue for that reason. They're kind of a big bully of the crayfish world. And to Valerie's question, as far as finding remains washed up, if you think you found a red swamp crayfish, please send me some pictures and we can figure that out, because they're not known to be in your lake, Valerie. So that would be really interesting if they are there. I'm guessing they're another species. It could be a white river crayfish maybe, or it could be perhaps large rusty crayfish. So let us know. I see Chris just put something in the chat as well. So yeah, certainly you could send them to Chris as well.
Great, thanks guys. There are a couple other questions. I'll start with Marty's question about there being a lack of predators for the snails. As far as the New Zealand mud snails go, they're not incredibly nutritious, and because they are able to seal up their shell so effectively, they can pass through the fish unscathed, and therefore they're not they're not really an adequate food source there. It's not an effective control method. But I will pass on this question to Maureen or Paul about do any of the snails carry the parasite that causes swimmer's itch?
I don't think that any of the snails that you discussed do. Paul, you might be better suited to answer that.
I seem to remember that maybe the banded mystery snail can be an intermediate host. Chris Hammerla is on the call. I think he may remember. I thought we both attended a presentation at the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference a while back, and I thought I remember hearing that, but I can't remember for sure. That's the only one that I think was possible.
Yeah, Paul and I attended a presentation. It was either their Lakes Convention, but the studies had shown that the bandids, the Chinese, they weren't, while there was a potential, they weren't like the #1 vector. It's actually some of our native snails that are and I don't remember which ones, but it was native snails that were the biggest problem for swimmer's itch. So just because you have a pile of the invasive bandids or Chinese does not mean that you're going to be inundated with swimmer's itch.
Great. Well, I will pass on the screen sharing so we can look at some more plants.